Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Development Diaries. This is a show where we interview leaders, innovators, change makers, movers and shakers from across the real estate development sector, learning about their career journeys, proudest moments, lessons learned along the way, and advice to their younger you. We also find out what excites them most about the real estate sector right now. I'm your host, John Guest, founder of Henry James, the talent advisor for choice for ambitious real estate leaders. Please do connect and follow us on LinkedIn and head to www.henryjamessearch.com to find out more. Today's episode, I'm delighted to be joined by David Partridge, an absolute industry legend who I'm sure a number of the listeners would already be familiar with. David is a former long-time senior partner and chairman of Argent and later Related Argent, pioneering and overseeing over 21 million square feet of real estate projects, including King's Cross, Brindley Place, Manchester Piccadilly and St Peter's Square. Since leaving in May 2025, David hasn't stopped pushing the industry forwards. He's still continued his work, bringing forward the UK net zero carbon building standard, as well as being founder of Senze, a business that we'll talk about later. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for taking time out to join us today. Really excited for this conversation. I think we're going to mix things up a little bit. We're going to ask a few traditional questions, and I hope a few questions that you haven't been asked before. Is that okay with you?
Sounds fantastic. Thank
Good
you.
stuff. So we get stuck in. So, as I said, I'm sure many of our listeners will know you for your work in the real estate development sector. I'm keen to take us back a little bit further and maybe look at your background before real estate. So, was it written in the stars to work in real estate development, or did you originally have other plans?
I actually qualified as an architect. So I guess buildings and architecture have kind of always been in my blood one way or another. I remember taking a test when I was about 12 at school around, what sort of A-levels should you do next and where should you focus? And I was, my housemaster came up to me and said, "You've rigged this, haven't you?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" "Well, it says that you should become an architect. And I know you've always wanted to become an architect." And I sort of said, "Well, maybe that's because it's written in the stars." So I've always been fascinated by the kind of combination of being able to be creative, be artistic, but also be incredibly practical. My wife says I have very square hands, which most artists have very long fingers. So I'm probably more on the practical side of architecture than I am necessarily on the artistic side. Hence why after I had joined a couple of friends of mine from university, I went to Cambridge and qualified there in the early 80s, practiced during the 80s as at Gebler Tooth Partridge with Sasha Gebler and Dave Tooth, Dave was my best man, so best friends, and then joined Argent in 1990. And I'm not entirely sure why I decided it would be great to move on from architecture. I think I felt a little bit like architects sometimes are at the bottom of the food chain. I'm sure there are lots of people further down the food chain, but I sort of wanted to be a little bit more involved in the actual creation of the real estate rather than just the creation of the buildings. Not that that isn't an important part of everything that we do, but that's where I started. Joined Argent in 1990 and, as you say, retired 35 years later, almost to the day, actually, because I think it was actually sometime in July 1990 that I started. So, I've been there ever since.
35 years in one business.
It shows a real lack of imagination, doesn't it, one way or another?
I think it shows loyalty, commitment, purpose. I think it's not many people that you meet when you talk to them about what they wanted to be, and it was that clear from school. Certainly remember my careers advisor not having that many choices for us. I don't even think architect was one of the options, although I do think at least it's one of the career choices that most people know within property. There's a vast amount of those that people don't know. And I remember doing a day with Regeneration Brainery, actually meeting year 10s and asking them. They came up with 3 between the whole class, which I think was architect, builder and engineer.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. Yeah, because back in those days, it had to be a profession. It was either architecture or doctor or probably the BBC, actually. Lots of people went into the BBC one way or another, or advertising in those days.
And I'm fascinated how you hacked your careers advising test without the use of AI or ChatGPT to do so, which obviously makes it a lot easier to do now. But if we took those things away, so being in development and being an architect, if we said that you couldn't have been either of those two, what would you have been?
I mean, I think that's really hard to say because I think being creative is absolutely fundamental to everything I do, whether that's drawing or thinking or imagining what one can do with whatever the problem is that's put in front of you, whether that's a real estate problem or any other sort of problem. So it would have to have been something in the creative industries one way or another. I can't play any music whatsoever, so I could never have gone into that. I love dance music, so yeah, maybe a club in Ibiza or something like that. Although maybe that's something one comes to later in one's life rather than setting out to do that from the start. But no, it would have to been something in the creative industries one way or another. So if it wasn't architecture, maybe it would have been graphics, maybe it would have been fine art or whatever. But I can't think of anything that doesn't involve somehow using one's hands and using one's brain to create interesting and lovely things.
Well, I think we're all pleased that your career did take this path because you've had such an impact on the real estate development sector specifically. So we're glad that you didn't quite open the
I'm glad I
Ibiza
didn't
Club.
have to make that choice.
There may be some breaking news on your Ibiza Club launch.
No, I don't think so. I think that would be it's a money pit one doesn't want to throw too much down.
Yeah, a different kind of placemaking.
Yes.
So Argent, 35 years.
Yes.
That is a serious amount of time in any business. And I know various different projects, iterations, roles, finally spending time as chairman. Could you tell us a little bit more about your time there and maybe share a couple of your proudest achievements?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I started really as the sort of design coordinator back then in the 90s, and of course, remember this was just before I think the first of about 5 or 6 recessions that we've been through. So I was really worried that I would be kind of the last one in 1990 and the first one out in 1991 when the whole development and real estate industry came to a close. So I was brought in really to sort of help coordinate design and act as a sort of design project manager, etc. But I think the reason I wasn't the first out the door, I remember actually, was because there were only 3 of us who could use a computer in those days, and we all learnt something called Lotus 123, which some of the more ancient listeners might remember. Others of you can Google it and kind of laugh. It's a bit like that Cadbury's Smash advert when you're looking at a potato peeler, aren't you? And kind of like they're all killing themselves laughing. That's what Lotus 123 was like. It was a very, very early form of Excel. But I, for some reason, ended up having to kind of add up all the various different costs of a development and then put them into a spreadsheet and use them as part of appraisal. So I thought, oh, well, that's easy. I can learn how to do that. And then I started learning how to read legal documents and things like that, because part of the process of developing involves borrowing money. And then it was my job to make sure that the monthly drawdowns from the banks all reconciled against the appraisals. And so suddenly I became this kind of jack of all trades, whereby I was never designing anything. I was never ever taken on to be an in-house architect. My job was to ensure that the designers and engineers and architects and everyone we were working with were actually producing things that we wanted to build and that we could afford to build. And so I suddenly became involved in every single aspect of the entire food chain of development, from pitching for new work, working out what the best planning would be, working with the architects and the master planners around optimizing the mix between the place and indeed the commercial elements of it. Like, so should we be doing offices? Should we be doing residential? What's the the best return on the capital? What capital can we deploy in the first place? So I would say to anybody who's going into that development, into that area, just be curious. Just don't just take the rules that someone hands down to you and says, this is what you have to do. I mean, without being too cheeky, just kind of go, well, why? And why do we do it that way? And tell me what the reasons are. And if someone says, okay, go away and read that banking document, because that will explain to you what you are or you're not allowed to do, then you understand the way these things work. And then next time you can actually be negotiating that banking document, because you can work out and you can tell them where some of the things that were written into the process just simply weren't working. So So that it was that curiosity, it was that desire always to understand more about what were the things that were driving what we were doing. Was it planning policy? Was it the return on capital for the investor that was the critical thing? Was it what the occupier wants? And of course, the answer is it's all of those things. And as a developer, you have to be at the fulcrum to provide the synergy between all those various different elements, which is actually where my architectural training really kicks in. Because as an architect, you're, hopefully the one person that is bringing together art, engineering, construction, all the various different aspects of things that have to go into a building, and reconciling them into something where you hope that the whole is kind of more than the sum of the parts. I took that thinking and went beyond it into all the other aspects of what it takes to create a piece of real estate. And that's where I think my curiosity took me, which allowed me to then begin to start expanding my role within Argent.
Yeah, and I think, fast forwarding to today, all of those skills are as relevant as ever. It's not just the storytelling piece, it's actually the commercial that goes behind it. Some people have got the commercial skills, but like the storytelling, it's being able to bring those all together and, as you say, bring the best of all of those worlds into something which is actually feasible, viable. You can win hearts and minds. Some of those hearts and minds might be public sector, some of those might be capital. I think all of those skills are so relevant. What makes you proudest when you look back on your career over those 35 years? What are the things that stand out? We talked a little bit off mic around CV getting longer and then shorter again towards the end of your life. What would be the kind of greatest hits?
Well, I mean, there's a number of great hits, but and this is a question I have been asked before, so I do have an answer, which is there. Obviously, I've been involved in creating some absolutely wonderful developments that have huge, landmark developments in their time. In Birmingham, you mentioned Brindley Place. Up in Manchester, everything we did at Piccadilly Gardens and Peter Square around there. These places are still there, and obviously King's Cross, which I live in as well. So, the first thing you do is you get a massive buzz about being able to walk around a place that you were involved in. You remember when it was a little squiggle on the back of a napkin. I remember flying out of Birmingham one time. We were taking all the team off to Ireland, I think, as a sort of celebration for some practical completion, and actually flying over Brindley Place and looking down on it and going, "Oh my God, I remember when that was on a 1 to 500 master plan, and now there it is." So you get an amazing buzz out of that. But actually, I know this probably sounds a bit trite, but I think my biggest success, the thing that I'm most kind of proud of is the team. It's actually building an organization which obviously has changed hugely over those 35 years, with different people who have been involved in it. Many of them moved on, and many of them moved on to do fantastic things. But actually, that is the skill of bringing together, and the challenge of bringing together a team and harnessing them into working really well together and creating the best of the best, in a sense, is actually the toughest bit of any job, whether you're a developer or whether in any sector, in any industry. And we always used to pride ourselves on the fact that actually we didn't have any chartered surveyors in the company at all. We were a bunch of different professionals. We did bring some RICS qualified people in later, so I got nothing against them. But it's the sense that in some developers, certainly in the early days, tended to be either run by accountants or people who really didn't have that creative flair. And my job was, alongside all my colleagues and partners, and we went through various different ownership structures, has been all about getting the right people into the job, into the right place, and then really giving them as much opportunity as possible to be, to be the best that they can be. And if you do that, and you can harness that, and sometimes you have to, push back a little bit and say, no, you're pushing that a little bit too far. There's this other aspect over here that is going to be a little bit more important, or whatever. Or sometimes you have to give people a bit of a kick to get them going. But when you have got that kind of great kind of collaborative and cohesive group together, you can literally climb mountains, push down walls and make amazing things happen. And I think that's the thing that probably for me is actually my proudest achievement.
And when I've spoken to people that have worked with you, I think that's one of the common themes is, always make time for people, foster a collaborative environment, bringing a culture that everyone feels like they have a voice. And even those that have since moved on, which again can be a leader's proudest achievement, is that those are able to learn while they're with the business, but take those skills elsewhere and go and do something purposeful somewhere else. It's a business that people still speak of fondly every time you speak to them.
Well, I'm really pleased to hear that, because that, in a sense, that's the best legacy you could ever have, isn't it? Because you can look at places and go, yeah, lots of people got involved in that, but if people still feel that being a part of Argent and now Related Argent was sort of formative for them, and as you say, many have moved on, and I'm so pleased that they're doing such fantastic stuff. And as I say, the biggest buzz is the fact that it isn't just necessarily all the other kind of co-leaders or the senior people. It's often, you see people coming into the organization as a receptionist or something like that, and then becoming kind of head of your asset management or residential management team or whatever. And it's just, isn't that great? They've grown up through the organization, and you've been able to give them the opportunity to really flourish. And for me, that's the best. And that thinking then goes into the places that you create, and not just about something that's going to make you, a few dollars and then you just disappear, or pounds. It's about creating places where people can flourish, whether they're visitors or, or workers or whatever. And that's really important. You haven't mentioned Brent Cross, which is the next project that Related Argent are working on, but that's all about finding a formula for reinvigorating an entire community, an entire area, not just, as it were, kind of creating a sort of dormitory or an office ghetto. And I think that part of that search for looking for ways to, as you say, add purpose, you've used that expression 2 or 3 times, into why people would even want to come to your buildings, I think, is a mark of distinction for everything that we've done. And hopefully that then will make sure that they are successful over the long term, not just over the sort of immediate, because you might have happened to capture the zeitgeist or got lucky in a market at a certain point in time.
I think, I talk a little bit, anyone that spent time with me will know that I talk about a concept called the younger you, which is a cultural discussion from one of my previous businesses that I think also ticked a lot of the same boxes. And your responsibility as a leader was to leave your seat in better shape for the person that came after you, whoever that may be. You might not have met them yet. It could be building a business so good your kids would want to work there. And I think the same applies when it comes to property and regeneration. It's that kind of culture in-house, culture in the place that fosters then culture of other businesses that might move into it. But taking that younger you concept and applying it to your own career and advice to others, what would you say to the younger David, knowing what you know now, starting out in his career, maybe 5 to 10 years in, looking to progress? What would your advice be?
I mean, I love that younger you thing. I think Tom Bloxham at Urban Splash always used to talk about this, the Athenian pledge, which is that they would always leave the place better for what than it was when they inherited it. And I think that's that's a drive, and the same thing for people. What would I say? I mean, are there many? There are probably more do's and do more ofs than there are necessarily don'ts, if you see what I mean. I guess getting, be patient, be curious, always think around a subject. Don't take anything for granted. Always wonder what's going on and why. I remember reading about the sort of concepts of wisdom, and I can't remember all of them, but I always remember one of them is that there's always another side to every single thing that's going on. So when people are doing things that you think are completely and utterly mad, or completely and utterly opposite of what you want to achieve one way or another, don't just run straight at them and go, "You're an idiot, this is wrong." They might be, but that's fair enough. You've got to understand why they're being an idiot and what it is that's actually driving them. And they're probably not complete idiots. They are probably people who have different motivations and different values. The moment you understand what those values and motivations are, then you've got a chance to resolve the situation. So you can then begin to start working out ways whereby You can give them a little bit of what they want, or maybe a lot of what they want. But maybe they just didn't articulate what it is that they're after and why they're stopping you from doing something. And often that's the best way to get the best outcome, is to make sure that you work for what I always call the highest common factor of various different things. Development is often the lowest common denominator because there are so many competing issues, whether it's cost or value or the local community or the planning policies or whatever it is. They're all competing against each other, and often you end up just getting to the lowest common denominator that's the least worst solution to every single bit of it. And of course, then it's no one wins. Whereas if you can work out what the highest common factor is, what are the things that we all actually agree on, and where are the areas that we're prepared to take a little bit less or give a little bit more, in those circumstances you end up with a better result. So that's what I'd always say to the younger you, is, in a sense, don't be impatient to jump to the solution that you think is right. You probably are right, but actually sometimes you might not be. And sometimes when you actually understand where other people are coming from, you will get a better solution. And there's, every time you talk about something, every time you share it, every time you go through the process of understanding everybody else's input into something, you actually do end up generally with a better solution to the problem. So never be scared. Never be scared to ask the question and to share what you're doing. Sometimes you're so proud and worried that you sort of think, oh, I've got to be the one that's got the answer. But actually, do you know what? People will respect you more for the fact that you admit that maybe you haven't got it 100% right, and that you're prepared to listen, and you're prepared to take their views on board. And most of the time, as I say, you end up with a better solution. And more importantly, you end up with a solution that everybody owns. So it isn't just you fighting against the rest of the world at that point. Suddenly you've got 4 or 5 people who have bought into this. And guess what? That's 4 or 5 people who are fighting against the rest of the world. And there's more chance that you'll get the solution across the line by virtue of the fact that you've been able to, through that collaborative approach, bring so many more people into the equation. And then you're not banging on a closed door. It's already half open because there's lots of you who are rushing through it, and everybody's got a vested interest in making sure that it's delivered. So they said that's an approach that we've taken in every single development we've ever done, and I think you could see it comes out. You win in spades on that basis, because everybody feels, the great thing is everybody thinks that they got the answer. So it's not just you. The moment someone comes and tells me, oh, I think we should do X, even though you knew that like a year ago, but it's taken you 12 months to convince them that it was their idea, then you're on a winner.
And I think going back to talking about your earlier career, it seems like you already practiced some of that advice with your curiosity, putting your hand up, asking why. Ironically, the advice to your younger you actually is as applicable for leadership of today as it is for those starting out in their careers. We start as children, very inquisitive, asking why all the time. I have a 7-year-old. I encourage it, although on the 7th or 8th time, sometimes you just got to admit that you just don't know the answer. But I think I see people lose that childlike inquisitiveness along the way, and trying to emotional intelligence of leadership of today is trying to understand what drives not just the people in their teams, because that's super important, but the people above them, the partners that they work with, public sector engagement. To get real estate project going of any scale, there are going to be people involved in that scheme that have various different motives for bringing it forward. And if you start with, here's my idea, you buy into it or not, you might be met with blank faces. Whereas if you try and spend some time understanding what they're trying to achieve, and then, as you say, storytell, sell the idea based on it being their own, it's got to be more crucial than ever in today's world for bringing anything forward.
Yeah, and it doesn't just apply to real estate. It applies, frankly, to relationships with and fathering, whatever, you mentoring, everything. I think that's really important. I mean, and we did this at King's Cross, for instance, where we genuinely didn't put pen to paper for about 3 years. We spent a long time gathering a consensus around what sort of place King's Cross should be. And so we came up back in 2001 with something called the Principles of Human City, which are quite kind of talk about diversity, talk about public realm, talk about inclusivity and accessibility and stuff, and all these things. And I've got one of my favorite sketches is a little cartoon that we did in about 2003, I think it was, for what Granary Square should be like. And it had, guess what? Kids running around in a fountain, people walking their dogs, lots of people, enjoying themselves. And I use a picture from, like, I still use a 2013 picture, never mind a 2023 picture, and go, well, back then we had no idea. We hadn't heard of Google, hadn't heard of MetaMark, hardly existed. Didn't know about Central St. Martin's, but we had a vision for what this place could be, which we had all bought into. That vision was signed up by the London Borough of Camden, by English Heritage as it was in those days, by the landowners, and by us as the developers. And we all had this idea what the place would be. And then we used that as the sort of lodestone for all the decisions that we made subsequently. It's like, does this adhere to the principles? Will it make it harder or easier to achieve those principles? And then obviously, as individual buildings and individual projects came forward, we were able to, we had a set of criteria which we could judge against, and they all came about because we'd all agreed them in advance. Can you imagine if we hadn't, and someone had come along and said, oh, I want to do X, you'd be like, oh, how do I decide whether that's a great idea or a rubbish idea, and how do I promote it? So it becomes very personal in those situations, as opposed to something that everybody's bought into.
Well, I totally agree. And maybe feeds into some clues for the next question. But having worked with a number of very talented development professionals over your career, a question I love to ask people: what makes a good development person, professional?
Well, probably I've hinted at quite a lot of that as well, actually. It's interesting that you say this idea of curiosity and, the child being childlike without being childish, I think is really important. I think a lot of people, unfortunately, as they get more senior, kind of get a little bit more defensive because things that they've done have, been successful. And so they think that's the right way to do it. They don't like to be challenged by underlings, let alone partners and sometimes, even customers, frankly. They think they know best. And maybe that has been successful in the past, and maybe that has resulted in that's the reason why they are where they are. But that isn't always the reason that where they should, that's why they're going to stop there. They're never going to progress. And I think always, a good development professional, like any good business person or any, frankly, any good person, should always be kind of like a little bit humble about their own skills, and open and prepared to listen to everybody else. In fact, want to listen and be, in a sense, I people call it humility. I almost call it sort of like industrial espionage or greed. You're sort of saying, okay, I don't know everything, but you guys know an awful lot of stuff. So if I can listen to you and understand where you're coming from and steal all your brilliant ideas and then use them, then I'm the one who's you're the mug for thinking that you know best, because you're just giving up all those other valuable insights from everyone around you. So be a sponge, like actually listen. Having said that, there will come a time when you have to come up with your, make up your mind. And again, there are some who just end up sponging and, just like never actually getting around to deciding. At some point in time, you've got to exercise your judgment when you've heard enough, and you've got to say, okay, well, I've heard that, heard this, we'd like to do more of that, but we simply can't. Here's my recommendation, and this is why. So you have to be decisive too, but I would suggest don't be decisive too early. And make sure that and even once you've made a decision, if it doesn't work out, be prepared to step back and go, oh, okay, right, I misjudged that bit, that criteria, I didn't know about X. Be prepared, be flexible. And someone always said to me, the great thing about you, David, is you play the ball from where you find it. And I think that's actually quite an interesting kind of way of looking at things, because so many people say, well, our objective was to get to X, and I'm going to ignore about the fact that, all those things that, have got in the way. I just got to get to X. And it's like, no, hang on a sec. You're in the rough over here. You're not on the fairway. You're using the wrong eye. You need to use this, not that. So sometimes you have to deploy different tools depending on where you've ended up. Yes, you still want to get the ball in the hole at the end of the thing, but you have a whole kit bag. So don't just, think that you can use your, 3 or 4. Not that I'm a great golfer, but which is probably, I'm a rubbish golfer actually. So, but there's more the point around just being aware of what's happening and be sensitive to it, and then adjust your judgment as you go along, rather than thinking that you were right all the way through.
So being adaptable, being
Yes.
open to ideas, being humble, but still confident. I think from my experience talking to people in the market as well, those are the leaders that people want to work for. Those that are humble enough to admit that they don't know everything, can absorb data to drive decisions, but when it comes to making one, they can act with conviction, share a vision. The people that are considering their options right now are looking up at the leaders, and leaders listening to this, you are being watched every single day, how you act, what you say, whether you like it or not. Those that don't paint a vision, those that don't feel like they can accept ideas from those beneath them, those that aren't open-minded are the ones where your people may well be considering their options right now.
Yeah, and my definition of leadership is a good leader is the first to take responsibility and the last to take credit.
That's a great summary. And I think on the adaptability piece, so talking of playing the ball from where it sits, you might change from trying to shoot par to actually being a bogey okay, or going for the birdie, then going for par if your first shot goes in the rough, not just pretending that it was the perfect shot. And I think that's typical of the last 5 years, really, when it comes to both the macro economic situation, but also specific to real estate development. There's been many challenges. I don't think any business plan's probably gone exactly. Maybe it hasn't in the history of real estate development, but certainly over the last 5 years, there's things that weren't written into people's appraisals that came along, like COVID, like Trustonomics, lots of different regulations, the Building Safety Act being one that we recorded an episode on a couple of weeks ago. Lots of different things that mean that you got to be fleet of foot. But of all of the challenges that you think that we face right now, what do you think the biggest blocker is to progress right now?
I mean, well, there is a fundamental economic issue which is really difficult to address, which is the fact that you can get 3.5 or 4% on a gilt, even more if you're prepared to invest in the United States. So why would you put that into real estate? And that's got nothing to do with real estate in itself as being being broken. It's more around the fact that our kind of entire sort of economic and social compact with government is frankly being pushed in every single direction. And I read The Economist all the time, and no one's coming up with, no one knows the answer to this. We kind of know when we're getting worse, but it's very hard to work out what's the best way to avoid it, because we've got this demographic issue around people getting older and people needing more help in every single way. We've got less and less of us paying tax. We've got all sorts of kind of worries around, how much we should be spending on defense versus how much we should be spending on climate change, and all these various different things, which are just sort of pushing the cost of borrowing for governments through the roof. And that fundamental kind of like, it's a cast iron, as long as governments keep paying interest, which they will do, 4%. Why would I go and invest in some real estate at 3 3/4? Unless I can see some growth. So that is the thing that's really killed us. And you're right, trust was the one that kind of flipped it over the edge. But the truth was, it was heading in that direction. We were all spoiled, frankly, by zero interest rates, and were given the opportunity to really, use that as much as luckily we were able to make huge progress in that time. But we, as an industry, we've got to convince investors that there's more growth in what we do. There's more upside over time than there isn't just literally sticking the money in the bank, where you're not going to get very exciting growth, but you're going to get something. And so I think the answer around that is everything that we've been talking about, which is around ensuring that we make places that people really value, somewhere where they want to work, where they want to live. If they've got choices, where do you go at the weekend? What are the places that are going to excite you and your kids and your friends and your parents or your grandparents or whatever it is that are going, those are the sorts of things where if we can create places that actually create economic and social value, then people will start investing in them. And that's the biggest issue for us now, is doing that in an environment where costs are still going, through the roof, where interest rates are high, values are suppressed. And for some reason, the cost of land never seems to go down, and yet you'd have thought that would be the one thing in the equation that would suffer, because it should do, because it's the fundamental at the bottom of the stack. But I guess because of planning policy and all sorts, the red tape that goes around getting anything off the ground, land is still, seemingly quite scarce and quite expensive, and yet it shouldn't be, because everything else has had to suffer, but the cost of land has stayed, pretty much where it is, or even going up in some sectors. So that's the equation that just doesn't seem to quite add up at the moment. So I'm really glad that, after 35 years, I'm leaving this to the next generation to figure out this problem. I'm kind of like, that's it, no more. I've done my bit. I can sit back on my laurels and be happy with the stuff that I've done, and kind of move into a slightly different area.
Says the man still involved in the UK net zero carbon.
Well, there's that side, yes,
And
definitely. It's net zero is
someone
the
that
issue.
rested on your laurels.
I meant in terms of development and regeneration.
Let someone else have a go.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, there's some interesting challenges in there, and obviously all very true. I think the cost of land is only crystallized as a loss if you sell it. So probably there's a bit of pride and not pressure from the banks that we saw before. So people don't have to make a decision.
Yeah.
Lots of funds have been raised for distress, which maybe hasn't come. Lots of people thought that this was going to be more of a blip than a longer term kind of suppression that it's turned out to be. But putting your money in a gilt or a government backed loan, US, UK, that doesn't create places. That doesn't make your kids' future better. That doesn't make jobs. It's surely it's still a really positive part of the industry to be involved in. So on a more positive note, what do you feel are the most exciting opportunities in the market over the next 3 to 5 years for other people to?
That's right. Well, I mean, I you talked about net zero carbon. I do think that actually is a real opportunity. I think that and it's not just an opportunity. Like all these things, it's a challenge as well. It's really, really necessary to come up with ways to build in a more responsible way, using less carbon, generating enough but not too much to keep us below the limits of the UK's share of the carbon budget, which is what the standard uses as its criteria for the limits that it's setting. And I think that there's so many people working in that area, actually, that it's really interesting to see the impact that it's having on everything from skills training through to construction materials. Low carbon concrete is something that people are looking to try and achieve. Low carbon steel. Don't overspecify, all sorts of things that you can do to design and to deliver real estate in a way that touches the planet as lightly as possible. I think there's a real future in that, and I think that we will see, and we already are seeing investors and customers, tenants, occupiers, purchasers actually not just saying, oh, that's a nice to have. They're saying this is an essential. We're not going to move into a building that in 10 years' time is going to be obsolete because it hasn't got the right systems in it. It's got fossil fuel, or it's over. In order to, the need to, if you needed to refit it or refurbish it, you'd have to spend a fortune in both cash and carbon to strip out and throw away all the stuff that was there. So these sorts of things are becoming almost, not just best practice, but becoming normal practice in what we do. And I think that that's an area where there's huge opportunity. I think also combined with that on the E side, there's more and more of an awareness that actually investing in social value as well as environmental value is going to be something that should hopefully reap dividends in the future as well. So you look to place your investment in places that are going to encourage their occupiers, their visitors, their investors and others to actually flourish one way or another. And so Brent Cross, which we talked about, actually really, really focuses on this. It's around creating a place that's going to, make the whole community better, improve well-being, improve job opportunities, more schools, more sport, give people places to get outside and get fitter and feel better and flourish as a result of that. Work hard, work more, in a more fulfilling way. These are the sorts of things. These are the avenues where I think we're going to see investment go. Because, as I say, yes, okay, you're investing in a government gilt. Now, that is some of that is being spent on education and health and all those sorts of things, but a lot of it is going in the wrong, as we can see, going the wrong way. By investing in a place that's going to have a direct impact on a community through education and health and all those and job opportunities, you can be more, you can see the impact that you're doing there, rather than think that every penny in your pound of tax that you pay is going in that direction, as opposed to just subsidizing a bloated government, or in one way or another. So I think that's where we're going to be able to persuade people to, as you say, be more active with their investment rather than just sit back and take the interest rate.
So you think one of the biggest opportunities right now is doubling down on the net zero piece?
Definitely.
It comes from a decision which I think is much easier for people to make around that younger you piece.
Yeah.
It's the right thing to do. If it doesn't tick that commercial box and they can't get capital interested, then it stays on the drawing board as an idea. It's obviously a slightly harder path in some cases to bring all this together. But if you can combine all of those things together, despite some of the macro trends being the reversal of that, with Trump, with people like Nigel Farage that I happened to turn on my TV over the weekend to, saying that he'd cancel net zero altogether, you still feel like it's the right way to go. That's what you're excited about, and that's what people should be focusing on.
I am, and I'm not oblivious to that kind of slight kind of rabble rousing. That you can see that they're only doing it because they think it's popular, and so there's a reason why it's popular. And so those of us who are responsible actors and professionals in actually and who do believe that it is absolutely still essential, it's our responsibility to win that argument. We can't just go, oh, they're all idiots, like I said earlier on. You can't go, he's just an idiot. Well, actually, yeah, he might be, but there's a lot of people who are listening to him and hearing what he's got to say. So we've got to work out a narrative that actually goes, that takes them on and says that actually net zero, yes, it's essential, but actually, by the way, it's not as expensive as you think it is, and it is good business, and it can create a resilient society, one that isn't relying on gas from. We haven't got North Sea any longer, so we're importing gas from outside. We're relying on the French basically pumping additional gas across the channel to us. Now, look what happened to Germany and Europe when they were relying on that coming from Russia. Not that I'm suggesting that the French are going to suddenly kind of invade us, but I'm just saying that in a world where energy is such a fragile thing, and access to oil and access to gas is an international issue. Why not make sure that you can use all the wind that you've got offshore, which by the way, we've got in abundance, is actually harnessed and properly stored and used within the grid. I mean, it makes complete sense to me. That's not about trying, some crazy idea that we're trying to promulgate against the common man. This is actually just pure common sense. So that kind of grid reinforcement, the work that Miliband's doing and others, which and thankfully the government are holding the ranks again, and it would be very easy to flop on that, as they have done on pretty much everything else that from a political point of view. But they are holding steady on that. So yeah, I think it's really important to listen to the arguments of people like Farage and Trump, because one could just say they're complete idiots, like I said earlier on. I mean, they might be, but we ought to understand where they're coming from and why they're so popular. And I think it's beholden on us as professionals and as responsible citizens, frankly, again, whether we're investing in real estate or anything else, to counter those arguments and to come up with good reasons why actually it makes an awful lot of sense to use all the renewable energy that we've got in abundance rather than being relying on gas to be pumped in by our friends from across the channel or anywhere else. So we as anyone who believes in actually achieving net zero and why it's important shouldn't just kind of keep going on and say no, we're just doing it anyway. We need to explain why, and we need to explain how. Frankly, I think the key thing is how it's not going to cost us an arm and a leg. That actually it can be achieved without adding a burden onto society. Because the Farage/Trump point of view is it's too expensive now. It's not really a problem. And if it is a problem, that's someone else's problem in 10 years' time. Those of us who realize that it is a problem know that if we just leave it for 10 years, it'll either become insoluble at that time, or the cost of solving it is going to be so high that the next generation will end up having to pay a fortune in order to address it. So that, I think, is where doubling down on net zero really should take us. It's not about kind of going, no, we're not going to listen to anybody. It's actually, I'm listening to everybody, and I need to come up with a convincing argument for why it's essential and, frankly, good business and good for society as well.
So there's an element there of practicing what you preach in your advice earlier, which is taking advice from others, admitting that you don't have all the answers. I think if you think of the way that people make decisions, they tend to make the initial decision emotionally and justify logically. But if you can't tick both boxes, you're probably not going to get that through. So the emotional piece is that it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
The logical piece is that actually it makes sense for capital reasons, for returns, for long-term gains, if we can call them that. No, interesting. Really, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, it's long-term value creation one way or another. And I think this is the point. It's like in 10 years' time, when we do get to a point when we're already 1.5 degrees over, and you start looking at the impact of that on what that means for us. Now, the cost of then clawing ourselves back from that, and the stranded assets that we might have as a result of not addressing that issue now, will be, more than 10 times the cost of doing it now. So that's where the common sense comes in. And that's where you have to have a bit of long-term vision and understanding, which I think that's not the case for short-term thinking around politicians wanting to win votes and get into power one way or another.
I think that's a topic for another podcast.
Definitely. Yeah, absolutely.
Fast forwarding to today, I know you're heavily involved in the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard, as well as being founder for a business called Senze.
Yes.
Could you tell us a bit more about what you're currently focused on?
Yeah, so Senze does exactly what I've been describing, I think. So working with the team who were setting up the standard, what became very, very obvious to me, and indeed they, when you look at any of the graphs and the calculations that go into the limits that we've been setting, essentially what the standard does is it takes the overarching carbon budget between now and 2050 that the UK theoretically can emit without going over one, or not contributing too much to go over 1.5 degrees. And it divides it out, and it says, okay, how much of it belongs to the UK? How much of it belongs to real estate? We use the CCC and other budgets for that. And then dividing it out sector by sector, how much can each sector emit between now and 2050 and still stay below, so that our bit of the pie that we're eating means that there's enough pie for everybody else, and we don't end up over the limit. 80% of the issue is residential. So we all get really excited about, brand new office buildings, or, leisure parks, or this, that, and the other that we can go, or big warehouses, or, whatever it is that we all hope we can achieve net zero carbon on them. But their share of the budget is minute in comparison with residential. And guess what? 80% of that 80% is existing homes. And so that's where the biggest issue is. And as a developer with Related Argent and others who are all, putting forward wonderful schemes for brand new buildings, yes, damn right, we should be able to achieve net zero carbon with those. because we're starting from scratch. But if we do not address existing homes one way or another, we might, we're just sort of tinkering around the edges, and that element, if it continues to use up as much carbon as we do. There's 29 million homes in the UK at the moment, and a significant chunk of them are, band D below on EPCs. So what Senze is doing is looking to address that very, very, very specifically around assessing exactly what's going on inside a home, going beyond the EPC SAP process, which is pure paper-based, and actually putting literally sensors into every single room to read temperature, humidity, and pressure, putting them all online through a hub, connecting up to the energy meter, doing a measurement using LiDAR of the home itself, and creating a live digital twin of a house. Now, it could just as easily apply to a shop or a restaurant or a office building or anything, but at the moment we're really focusing on homes because we think that that's where the biggest need is. And then with that live digital twin, you can work out exactly how much energy is leaking from it, what the heat loss coefficient is, what you can then begin to start simulating, what sort of interventions you could put in order to be able to reduce that heat loss. Is it insulation? Is it double glazing? Is it just going through and making sure that the leaky window reveals are being properly sealed, or whatever it is? And then you can calculate exactly what the environmental performance of the that asset will be after you've finished. And then a year later, you can report on it because you've still got the live digital twin up and running with the sensors, and they can say, guess what? The heat loss used to be X and now it's Y. And guess what? The energy use used to be X and now it's Y. And guess what? This is how much carbon you've actually saved. This is how much money you've saved. And so what this is doing, and we're focusing initially within those 29 million homes on the 4.5 million homes that are social housing, because again, we see that that's where the biggest need is. And we're going to big landlords, housing associations, and local authorities and others who own tens of thousands of homes, and saying to them, not only can we actually record everything that's going on within your asset, and actually it was really interesting, there was a paper that just came out literally last week from government around the need to have a better record of what is actually going on within your portfolio. We can do that. We can deliver live. We can tell a housing association the 10 worst rooms in their portfolio and then tell them how to resolve those, as opposed to the traditional way that at the moment is that you end up going down what's called a PAS 20 to 35 route, which is where you just find out vaguely which is the worst home, and then you try and hit the whole thing with a complete full retrofit, which in some cases can cost 50, 60, 70,000 pounds, when actually you could have only spent 5,000 pounds on just rectifying the one worst bit of the building and achieve 90% of the savings. So we're being able to effectively give them tools for recording, tools for planning their capital expenditure, and then really importantly, afterwards, tools for reporting post the retrofit to be able to demonstrate exactly what they've achieved. And so one of the biggest drivers behind this are not just the housing associations and the local authorities themselves, but banks who are really interested in lending into this space. The National Wealth Fund with Barclays and Lloyds have put £1 billion aside in order to do this. But they have no way of knowing what the impact of what their lending is actually achieving. But by assessing it in advance, using that assessment to tailor your expenditure and your capital program, and then reporting afterwards to say, guess what? This is how much energy we were using before, and this is how much energy we're using now. This is how it's helping the occupier who is paying a lower energy bill and also getting a better home to live in. They can point to absolute real achievements, which of course is hugely important for them in terms of the their own raison d'etre in lending in the first place. So it's a fascinating project, and no mean kind of aspiration to kind of get 29 million homes out of up to effectively a band C or whatever. but really fascinating, really interesting.
So data driving better decision making.
Yes.
And it sounds like you're having to practice what you preach on the understanding people's motivations, priorities. So that is probably not the only thing on their agenda right now either.
Tons of other things to solve, but at the moment they're being asked to throw capital at probably the wrong thing. And so what we could do is help them actually plan that and tailor it.
Be more efficient.
Yeah, exactly. And then measure the impact of it. And again, I think this is something that's coming around more and more. We're seeing a much more sophisticated, whether it's social impact, environmental impact, all these sorts of things, a much more sophisticated idea around, well, tell us what you're doing, why you're doing it, and then tell us afterwards whether you actually achieved it or not. People are much more interested in that. And of course, data could do that for you.
And where do people find out more about Senze if they're interested?
Well, we got a website up and running, sense.co.uk. Have a look at that. You could drop us a line on, and I'd be delighted to come and talk to anybody who's interested, whether you're a practitioner in this space or whether you're maybe a landowner or you're advising landlords or whatever. We've got a big publication coming out at the end of October where we've done 150 individual homes funded by a big bank, one of the high street banks, along with a housing association in the West Midlands. And what we've tried to do is we've tried to pick a really kind of typical cross section of some bungalows, some older houses, some newer homes, some flats, some terrace houses, some end of terrace houses, and so on and so forth, and tried to learn some rules around. We're using AI to look through the data that we're achieving and kind of learning which ones are the ones that are most likely to need more or less than was perhaps planned for. Some really, really interesting stuff coming out of this. A lot of the older homes that we've measured actually perform way better than their EPCs, hence why you can actually need to spend less, which is the big argument against the kind of the naysayers. It's like, actually, no, this is not going to cost us an arm and a leg. You can achieve huge energy savings by just doing minimal things. And interestingly, the more new stuff is performing way worse than their EPCs, which is another issue altogether. And I think a lot of that is to do with the fact that people are, in the last few years, have been much more reliant on technology and materials that have deteriorated a lot faster than we thought they would do. So solid wall in construction, for instance, actually performs way better than the SAP kind of model says you should do in terms of U values. Whereas people who've been trying to fill cavities and things like that just haven't achieved that for whatever reason, because that technology was a bit pioneering in the early days. So we're learning all these lessons from these 150 case studies, and we're going to be publishing that. It's a report that's been produced by the Good Economy, and it's going to be validated by the University of Birmingham and Salford, who are leaders in this sort of verification of environmental performance. So they will be actually validating the tech and the results that are coming out of it, to be able to say, well, actually, look, when you say the temperature's X and here and at Y outside, the algorithm you're using to calculate the heat loss is actually correct. So yeah, I think at that point, that's when we're going to begin to start talking to government. We're going to start talking to big housing associations. I mean, for us at the moment, we've done about 400 or 500 units in total. We want to get to 5,000 by the end of the year. Mm-hmm. And so we've been gearing up the technology in order to be able to cope with that level of installations. But we think we can actually really help those landlords to be much more effective with what they need to do.
I think hearing you speak about it, you can tell that the fire still burns after 35 years, that you're not done yet.
Yeah, of course. It's fueled by renewable energy, of course, which is
the younger you, leaving the next generation in better hands. But before we wrap up, David, it's tradition on the podcast to leave a question for the next guest to answer. So not knowing who that is just yet, what would you like to ask them?
Well, okay, so I was going to say it a bit earlier, but when you mentioned that this is, I thought I'd save it. So I told you all my source material comes from The Economist one way or another, but I was reading about something called the hammer question. and I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but apparently he was a researcher at Bell Laboratories in the sort of 1980s, 1990s, and of course this is when Bell was the sort of, they were the people who turned the traditional telephone into, they started the technology that ended up with an iPhone or whatever. And he apparently went around all his colleagues in the various different research departments of Bell and said to them, he said, I'm going to ask you three things. He says, what are you doing at the moment? What is the biggest issue in your sphere of technology? And why the hell aren't you working on that? And this has become sort of, amongst not just the geekies, who are doing R&D, but for me, I think it's actually a question that everybody should be asking themselves, which is, what is the biggest issue within your field? And I think you should probably qualify that by saying, which you might be able to have some impact on. We're all going to go off and solve the Ukrainian war or the Middle East question, aren't we? Much as we would like, it needs it. But what is the biggest field that you could have an impact on, and then why the hell aren't you actually working on it and trying to find a solution to it? So that would be my question, poor person, whoever that is. But that was my way of post-rationalizing why I've ended up in net zero. I've kind of got there. And then when I was posed that hammer question, I thought, yeah, actually, you know what? I did ask myself that question. I asked myself what was the biggest issue. And then I thought to myself, well, why the hell aren't I doing it? So I have tried my best to come up with something that can actually address it. And hopefully it'll be something that really does have, big impact one way or another.
A big question to end with, and something that we should all maybe spend some time thinking about. And the next guest is in for a treat. David, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. Shared some fascinating insights. You've had an amazing career. Hope the listeners have found it really interesting. So just thank you again.
Well, it's been a great privilege. Thank you very much indeed. It's always nice to have the opportunity to share experiences and help that next generation to start hopefully do the things that they're best at, and hopefully you'll invite me back in a couple of years' time and I can tell you how well Senze is going on and whether or not we have actually achieved the impact that we hope to.
It's a deal.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.